Deputy Lindsay de Sausmarez, welcome to part 2 of this Guernsey Press Politics podcast. We're going to talk about issues that are not related to the 2026 budget, so the other areas that the Policy and Resources Committee is responsible for, at least some of them. We've got a few subjects to range through, and we'll try and go through these at some speed. First of all, you've had in some ways quite a difficult start to your life as president of the Policy and Resources Committee. You lost one member, Deputy Latoc, and now you're faced with your Treasury lead, Deputy Gavin St Pierre, and a recommendation from the Commissioner for Standards that he should be suspended from the States for 25 days. Now, I know that report has not yet come to the States. We broke the story a few days ago. You may not even have seen the report. But just talk in general terms. I mean, how inconvenient, how annoying is it for you to be faced with those sorts of challenges that really have nothing to do with you, but actually do have potentially quite a significant effect on your committee?
Well, I think it's always wise to expect the unexpected in this role, and that's certainly played out. But in terms of that particular issue, the report isn't yet in the public domain. We haven't yet seen how it's going to be framed in terms of a policy letter from SAC, or indeed whether SAC's recommendations mirror those reported. So really, I can't preempt it. There's a process that needs to run, and I can't really say anything at this point until that process has run its course, or is at least in progress.
In principle, though, would you ever be prepared to deviate from the recommendation made by the Commissioner for Standards, or would you always say the States really just needs to follow the recommendation, having set the process up, appointed the Commissioner, it has no choice but to follow her recommendations?
Well, we've got an independent process for good reason, and I think irrespective of whether it's a commissioner or in the previous years a panel or whatever, the whole reason you have an independent person or body is to provide a more objective view, and it's not political colleagues taking a subjective decision.
If the States decides to suspend him for 25 days, will you ask him to resign as Treasury lead or as a member of PNR, or do you think he could see out that suspension without any effect on his role on PNR?
Well, again, I just can't preempt. I can't preempt the report, the policy letter, or anything like that. So I'm really not in a position to comment yet, because we do need to let that report be published by SAC, and so we can have those conversations.
Okay, let's move on to talk about Airlinks, because it's a story that we've written about in the past week or so in the paper. There are clearly discussions going on about the possibility of resuming a link with Heathrow. What are the chances, do you think, of the Guernsey-Heathrow link being restarted in the relatively near future?
I can't really comment on any specifics. Apart from anything else, it's not a decision for PNR to make in terms of any specifics. But what I can say is that we have had lots of representations from the business sector in general about connectivity in general, and the impact of connectivity on business. And that is something that is obviously a key consideration. But from PNR's perspective, again, we need to look at that bigger picture and understand some of the potential trade-offs. So we do need to understand in any new route development that might take place, whether it's to a London airport or indeed to somewhere in Europe or anything else, what the implications are for the rest of the connectivity picture in the whole, and we have to understand the various interrelating factors. So, for example, income from the airport or generated through the airport and things like that. So it's quite a complex picture. And there is sort of various considerations that have to be taken into account. But I can't comment on any specific conversations, not least because it's not PNR that's having them, So
yeah, I mean, Airlinks policy is a matter for economic development, but PNR would have to sanction the expenditure of any subsidy that an operator would want to resume the Heathrow link or indeed any other route. I mean, has PNR indicated to economic development that you would be prepared to back a public subsidy, a taxpayer's subsidy, to resume the link to Heathrow if they were able to negotiate one?
It's not that straightforward because it's not just about subsidies, it's about a wider economic impact, and that wider economic impact can include some direct states impacts, for example, to ports income, but it also might allude to wider economic impacts for the island more generally. So we do need to look at the bigger picture in all these considerations, and I would try and broaden out that question to connectivity more generally, and I'm not just relating, talking about any individual potential routes that might be under consideration.
Would you like to see the Heathrow link resume? I mean, you have a slight difference of opinion on your committee, don't you? Because Deputy Burford, who has just been elected to PNR, has very publicly in the past been critical of the arguments to resume the link with Heathrow, and some other state members have as well, arguing that it would just cannibalise passengers from the Gatwick route and therefore harm Orkney's bottom line. I mean, where do you stand? Where does your PNR stand, collectively or by a majority, on whether it would be a good thing for Guernsey to resume its previous link with Heathrow?
Well, I can't give you a detailed answer to that. First of all, because I can't talk about any particular conversations that are happening in relation to any of the potential new routes. Those are commercially confidential conversations that could be relating to all manner of different routes. But also, it's not just about subsidies. It is about that bigger impact. So it's not an accurate characterization to say someone is in favour or not in favour of a particular route, because it absolutely depends, or it would depend on the detail. It would depend on how that is done, the wider impacts that it might have. So there's a really big basket of considerations that have to be looked at in the round. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a more specific answer. But also, I do think we need to respect the fact that, any conversations that have taken place historically or might take place in future, these are ultimately commercial conversations. And, I'm certainly not in a position to discuss any detail around them.
Let's move on to the future of the sixth form. And I know that these are areas which primarily engage other committees, but of course PNR has a role because of its function for coordinating policy, but even more so its budgetary responsibilities. Whatever happens with the future of the sixth form, money is going to have to be spent, and so PNR is engaged in those conversations. Mm-hmm. Have you asked Education, Sport and Culture to look again at the options for the future of the sixth form? I mean, the previous ESC was absolutely nailed to the idea of building a new sixth form centre at Les Osway. Have you asked ESC to rethink that policy or to look again at the options?
Well, I haven't had to, because the circumstances are such that the previous committee's plans were effectively put into abeyance, I think is probably the best way of describing them, in recognition of the fact that we are in very challenging times, economically speaking, and that those plans were just not affordable to progress. So I think there's, it's just natural. And this is the case of all major projects. I really do need to stress that we always have to assess whether any particular project is the right way forward, is presenting value for money, is going to deliver what we hope it's going to deliver. So I wouldn't pick out the sixth form as a case in its own right in that respect. I think that applies across the whole portfolio. We need to constantly be making sure that all our projects are doing what we need them to do at the best possible value.
Given the financial constraints on the states, is it fair to say that you can't at the moment envisage circumstances in which your PNR would be prepared to back funding the development of a sixth form centre at Les Osway?
I think it's fair to say that I think the fundamental rationale for it, and this is me speaking personally, I'm not necessarily speaking on behalf of the committee, but I have been very open about my views. And I should also declare that I have a child at the sixth form right now. So I am sort of personally invested in this. I've got 3 more in the pipeline as well that I hope will get there one day. But I think it's fair to say that I've never personally been persuaded by the rationale for that particular model, if you like, or proposal, partly or possibly primarily because of the challenges related to scale. And since that proposal was agreed by the states, that challenge has become more pronounced. So we've had updated figures in terms of student numbers, I'm talking, that show that we have even fewer students than we originally envisaged for this particular point in time and going forwards. And that really does have a material impact on the quality of education that can be delivered. And things like the range of curriculum choice, so the breadth of options that are available to students. It gets quite technical and complicated, but basically it boils down to economies of scale is probably the wrong way to put it, but certainly challenges relating to scale is one of the aspects that I've always been most uneasy about. And it's not to say that there aren't ways of overcoming those challenges. I think there are, but we need to be satisfied that we have looked at this in light of the information that we have now.
Do you think it's likely then that this state is going to have basically a fresh policy debate about the future arrangement for sixth form studies? I mean, you won't be able to go just to a kind of capital spending debate, that you may have to rethink the model that was agreed by the previous assembly.
I wouldn't like to preempt anything like that, because it may well be that there are enough mitigations that can be put in place that would mean that you didn't need to do any sort of fundamental rethinking. I'm certainly not in the right position. I'm a member of PNR, not ESC. I'm certainly not in the right position to jump to any conclusions on that front. I think, from the world of E&I, we learnt that there is always an engineering solution. And I think there is something equivalent in this respect as well. There are always sort of mitigations that you can put in place that may help overcome challenges. So I wouldn't like to preempt what might be available as an option or viable as an option. But yeah, all I can say is that along with all of the projects that we're doing, we need to, constantly make sure that we are delivering what the community needs at the best possible value.
One small aspect of the sixth form debate, which PNR is responsible for, in addition to financing, is property services. And of course, there is this issue of state staff and the plans to move them into what was the sixth form centre at Les Varens. Now, the previous Education Committee said it wasn't their decision to move staff into that building. It was a property services decision and therefore PNR's responsibility. I don't know the facts in relation to that decision that was made then, but certainly the extant position seems to be that staff are moving into the sixth form centre. Now, if there is reconsideration about sixth form studies, it doesn't take a genius to work out that one of the options, in theory, that ought to remain on the table is reattaching a sixth form to the secondary school at Les Varens. Have you had any discussions with property services about whether the movement of staff into Les Varens can be stopped or paused until the States has decided what to do about the future of sixth form studies?
I have certainly asked some questions, but I haven't got enough clarity on the answers to give you a particularly helpful answer to your question. But what I would say is it may well be the case that the decision was taken by the property unit. But I remember I've got an email chain that goes back to, I think, the early part of 2023, and I was discussing with education officers. So I think maybe the idea or the original suggestion did come from that part of the organisation. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. The decision was made. I think
you could stop. Your committee could stop it, couldn't you? You could issue a direction to property services not to move staff in there until the States has resolved the future of sixth form studies.
I don't think you necessarily need to do that, though, in order to keep that option open if that is what your aim is. I think where it becomes more challenging is if you spent a very significant amount of money in making alterations to that building to repurpose it. I think that is actually where it becomes a little bit more challenging. But ultimately, at the end of the day, all of those considerations have to be taken into account in the round.
Let's move on to housing, because I mean, at the general election, that was a significant issue in the whole life of the last states. It was perhaps, other than the deficit, the issue number one, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when the states agreed that the strategic housing indicator required about 1,500 homes to be built by 2027. Now, in the period since that debate in 2027, clearly there isn't going to be anything like an additional 1,500 homes built. Can you just build a picture for us about what is the realistic objective at the current time around house building? How many new units can the states, in conjunction with private developers and with the GHA, actually get out of the ground across the island, let's say in the life of this state's term? Do you have a kind of handle on what is realistic, given that the previous indicator obviously wasn't realistic?
So the indicator is realistic in that the indicator's job is to tell us what the need is. It's about the need of the community. So you can't say that the state strategic housing indicator wasn't realistic. The one complication to that is actually there has been a reassessment of one of the main values that went into that, which may well alter the state strategic housing indicator. But just to take a step back, if we can paint a picture, basically the housing need of the island in terms of what we need as a community to adequately house everyone in the island has always been, well, certainly since about the start of the millennium, around 300 homes per year. There was a dip in the 2012 to 2016 political term because there was a bit of an anomaly then. Our population at that point was actually dropping quite significantly, and it took, so I think there was a peak in about 2011, and then it didn't regain that population level till 2021. So there was a whole decade within which our population actually dipped before starting to climb again. So actually that eased off some of the pressure on the housing need and gave us a bit of a false horizon. So at that time, everyone said, well, 300 homes is clearly too much. And I think the states downgraded it. But actually, looking at the longer term view, that was a mistake because Guernsey's housing need has consistently been around 300 homes per year for the last, nearly three decades.
And we've been achieving about 100 in recent years. So,
yeah.
So I'm not saying that 300 is suddenly going to be delivered, but I mean, what is now a reasonable expectation in this state's term? By 2029, how many new units could the island reasonably see?
Well, I'm not going to give you a specific number for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I haven't seen the any updated calculations. But what I will do is just quickly paint the picture of what happened since basically 2020, so the start of the last political term. We had a perfect storm of different factors. We had a very, very rapid increase in population. I mean, unprecedented in recent times. And so because we'd had that dip beforehand, the construction sector had effectively and very understandably scaled back their operations. They weren't putting as many new units into the market. And in cruel irony, our housing needs soared because of the rapid population increase through COVID and beyond, just at a time when the market actually couldn't provide nearly as many homes as we might under more normal circumstances. So because of COVID and Brexit and the sort of macroeconomic climate, if you think 2022, we had Ukraine, we had Liz Truss, all of those factors combined meant that actually it was really, really challenging to actually build new homes because the cost of materials had soared, the cost of labour had soared, the availability of material and labour was more difficult, and the financial climate had changed as well. So we are now past the era of free money, effectively, and cheap borrowing. So suddenly access to finance was more difficult and finance was more expensive as well. So all those factors combined to create this sort of perfect storm where suddenly, just when we needed it, just when we needed more homes than ever, in a hurry, the market was uniquely poorly positioned to do that. Then if we layer on top, and this is where it gets more to your question, we layer on top some of the other issues. Bearing in mind that actually 90% of the homes in this island are private, so actually most of the home building we would expect to come from the private sector. But the States was, did make a conscious decision to be more proactive and to up its own game in that respect. Because we'd had this artificial dip previously, we hadn't kept that supply of land up. So we hadn't got a pipeline of land to develop. And it takes typically about 5 years between identifying a site through buying it and planning it and actually building it out before you can actually move people into any new units on it. So because we hadn't done that in terms of our pipeline supply of land in the previous few years, we had to start from square one in 2020, 2021. So we were then buying big sites that we knew wouldn't be able to be developed for at least 5 years. Add to that, the reasons those sites were still available was because those are the ones that are the most challenging to develop. So those are the ones with things like flood risk, problems and contamination and basically all the easy sites that had already been developed. So we were left with the hardest sites to develop at a time when the market was really struggling to deliver. However, to answer your question, that was a bit of context that I hope is helpful in understanding where we're at now. It's not just about the number of new units. One of the most useful things that the State Strategic Housing Indicator does is it illustrates the mismatch, not just in terms of number of new units, but in terms of the type of units needed. And that is in terms of their size and the type, for example, private market or affordable. So it showed us, for example, that we really needed to expand the affordable housing sector in the island, and that's something that States has agreed to do. But it also showed us that what we really, really need is more smaller units. And so one example of why we need more smaller units is actually Guernsey is awash with larger units. And we know that we have a lot of people particularly older people, who live in homes that are larger than what they technically need. And some of those people are perfectly happy living in larger homes. But we know that actually some of those want to move into a home that is smaller and more manageable for them and more affordable for them. But if we don't have enough new smaller units coming into the market, then they've got nowhere to downsize into. And that actually has knock-on implications for families looking to upsize into larger family homes. So it sort of puts the brakes on the whole market. So it's really important that we're not just focusing on the number of new units, but also the type and size of those units as well. What I would say is that while I can't give you a specific figure, I am very confident that this is a massive priority. And while it's quite lumpy in that you might get 400 units delivered one year and none the preceding year or the year after, I am persuaded that actually we have done quite a good job at laying the foundations, if you pardon the pun, and setting the scene so that those homes can be delivered.
But you have provided a very eloquent and persuasive analysis of the problem and what has been done by the previous states to try to turn around what was a long-term problem. But people who are struggling to get on the housing ladder and people who are caught up in what it really is a housing crisis want to know that there is going to be an acceleration in house building in this state, because the last states, and they weren't the community's numbers, I mean, they were the state's own numbers. Yeah. The number of new units developed was a third or less than the indicator the states signed up to. So are you very confident that there will be, in this state's term, there will be an acceleration of the number of new units and that you will get much closer to the indicator than the previous assembly managed?
Yes.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I can be confident is now, one of the big differences is we now own Leal's Yard, for example.
Okay. How quickly do you think we will start to visibly see a difference in the rate of new house building?
So bearing in mind that the majority of new house building we expect to come from the private sector, I just see from travelling around the island, I haven't checked the latest stats, but it feels as though there are a lot of new homes under development, more new homes under development than there have been in previous years that are either just coming onto the market or about to come onto the market. But I know that we've done work with those private developers individually, site by site, any site that can yield 10 or more units that is developable, basically. We have literally gone and sat down with them and had those conversations and said, tell us what the barriers are, what's getting in the way. And to be honest, we went into that piece of work expecting them to say, oh, it's just that financially it's a lot less viable to develop homes and we can't, do it in a way that makes economic sense. So states, can you throw some money at us? We didn't get that from anyone. We actually got really practical issues that related to other aspects that in many cases we have been able to deal with. So we have been instrumental in unlocking some of those private sites, irrespective of the ones that we are more directly responsible for developing out ourselves.
I mean, there are major sites owned by the GHA.
Yeah.
And the states has been involved in the purchase of some of these. And there has been some criticism from developers. There was some criticism from previous states members that the states was kind of land banking, but that these sites were not being developed. Now, I know you won't agree with that.
Well, because it's not correct. Yeah.
And I don't want to get into that. But will we see development on some of those sites?
Yeah.
Kenilworth, the data park, in the life of the states?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to be fair, the reason they haven't been developed is not for want of enthusiasm or political will to do so. They have been very, very practical barriers that have got in the way of that. So, for example, there was an insurance requirement that flood risk was addressed sufficiently to the satisfaction of insurers before we could develop out Park Lalashire, formerly known as Kenilworth, for example. And so those are some of the sort of material things that have prevented development from taking place. What I would say, though, is that now that the States owns Leal's Yard, that gives us much more opportunity to actually sort the infrastructure out. And that infrastructure can enable much better and more effective development of the area when taken into account of, the wider context. So, for example, one of the main concerns always voiced by residents, and I'm very, very sympathetic to this, is, well, you can't put 300 new homes here. Just think of the traffic impact. And yeah, absolutely, that would be a completely material and legitimate thing to be concerned about if it weren't addressed. But actually, because we, the states, now own that site and we can be much more involved in planning the infrastructure, including the transport infrastructure, we can make sure that it's done in such a way that it supports improvements across the whole area. And connectivity is much better and more comprehensive. And
okay, so when we sit here in 3.5 years' time, you are certain or you are confident that there will be homes either on or coming out the ground at Leal's Yard and Park Lalashire and the data park? I mean, is that what you're saying, or are you saying you're not quite sure?
No, I'm confident that you will see material progress and you will see, visible, tangible signs of that progress as well. What I can't give you is, because some of these things are still in flux, how those homes are going to be delivered, some of the plans. So, for example, Leal's Yard, obviously, there were plans approved under the previous owners. We are now taking this opportunity to do the infrastructure a little bit differently, which I think will have much greater benefits across the whole area. But obviously, that does mean that those plans will need to be redeveloped accordingly. So I can't give you the specific timelines for any of those sites. But what I can say is that I personally am absolutely determined that we will be seeing material progress, and I'm confident that you will see the signs of that, and you can hold my feet to the fire in that way.
Okay, a much smaller problem. P&R is responsible for the collection of and presentation of statistics and data in the States. There is an ongoing and now quite long-lasting problem that you don't have access to recent data, do you? In some respects, the labour market data is out of date. The population data is out of date because there is some problem with the rolling electronic sensors. Is that causing a problem? I mean, if you don't understand what's happening out in the community, it's harder to make policy, isn't it? Is that causing some problem for PNR and States committees? And do you have any idea when that will be resolved?
I don't have a specific timeline, but it's something we are working on, and I think the smoke signals are looking positive in that respect. What I would say is that it can have, one of the most interesting things is where any issues come to light which have impacted previous analysis. So one of the things that we need to do as and when we get up-to-date data, which is materially different from how it was previously presented, is to make sure that any assumptions that were made using the old data set have been recalibrated. So, for example, a really good example of that is the State Strategic Housing Indicator. If it turns out that any of the assumptions that were used in modelling the housing indicator have changed, we will probably need to go back and do that work again. Now, the great news is that's a process that we brought in-house, so that is something that is easy to run. But I mean, I'm a data geek. I think it's really important that we do have as up-to-date data as possible. I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that none of our data is up-to-date. Actually, one of the things that I found most surprising is when the other jurisdictions are involved, because we share a lot of our homework. Forums like the British Irish Council, for example, our housing indicator model or tool was developed using learnings from Wales and Scotland in particular. And so there was a lot of collaborative working that went on between the jurisdictions. And whenever we've had experts coming into the island to have a look at it, they've actually been very complimentary about how much data we do have in comparison to other jurisdictions. So I think it would be unfair to present this as all our data is out of date and rubbish. That's absolutely not the case. I would say that some issues have been identified, but the good news is they've been identified. We're working on them. So it is important we get that right.
Organisationally, in recent years, that there has been quite a lot of centralisation in the States, and you'll remember that committees lost their chief officers, and so at a staff level, there has been centralisation. Is that something that you and your PNR are comfortable with, or do you want to reverse some of that centralisation that happened?
I think that, for me, is the wrong way of approaching the question. I think we need to look at the outcomes. We need to figure out what outcomes we're trying to achieve and the best way of delivering that. And there's a balance, isn't there? I mean, generally, the motivation behind greater centralisation is a drive for efficiency and effectiveness, and there are economies of scale to be exploited, and I think that is true. But at the same time, on the sort of counterbalance side of the argument is you want to make sure that you have the people who are most knowledgeable and most expert in that particular area involved in whatever policy area or project it is. So there is a balance to be struck, but I would look at it through the lens of how we're delivering good outcomes.
You're not moving back to a model where committees have their own chief officers?
I personally quite miss the chief officer function. I thought that was, it was personally not a move I was excited by. But certainly there have been no decisions along those lines.
Okay. Finally, I just want to ask you about your leadership style, because you've been PNR president now for 3 months. I recall that when you stood for the role, you emphasised that you wanted PNR to be enabling and you wanted to support other committees. Has that, to some extent, put you in a difficult position? Because has it meant that it's harder for you to say no to committees? If other committees are proposing things to the states, you perhaps as PNR don't want to be seen to be challenging them. I mean, the education law, perhaps.
I brought an amendment to that.
Okay, but that was on quite a minor issue. But do you feel, whereas in previous states terms, you have been able to be quite independent? I mean, do you feel that in your new role you are slightly constrained and that you have to be seen to provide other committees with support, whereas you previously would have been more challenging?
No, I don't see it through the same lens, to be honest. The reason we are working in the way that we're working, and to be a little bit more specific, We are, for example, working with a system where instead of committees doing their thing and then bringing proposals at quite a late stage to P&R to get their view, and then P&R going, oh, well, hang on, you haven't thought about this, or we don't like this, and that causing delays. We want to work differently in that we want to be involved at the earliest practical point which we can be helpful, so that we're aware of the work as it develops. We can avoid any sort of potential conflicts in that respect, sort of late stage, so we can do things in a way that is just more efficient. So I say this because my previous experience on committees has been frustrating in that quite often P&R's involvement has come very late in the day, and then by the time we've managed to get it in front of them, they have sometimes not fully grasped what we're trying to achieve. They haven't necessarily had the right people in the room. So we're trying to address all of those issues. We've got individual P&R members of the first point of contact or link with each of the committees. So we've got someone where, as the president of a committee, you can say, oh, I just want to make sure that P&R is aware of this bit of work that we're doing. This is what's involved. That P&R member then feeds back to the rest of the committee. We've got a standing item on all of our agendas, which enables us to feed that back into the committee so that we are much more aware of what committees are working on. It's not about disagreeing or agreeing with committees. It's about providing them with timely engagement and hopefully support in a way that is more useful and more practical than the way I think it used to work.
Okay, I mean, but committees openly disagreeing in the States is something that's just been part of our system for decades. I mean, are you saying that you are quite comfortable, as the term develops, that if committees come forward with proposals you don't agree with, that you will oppose them and ask the states to vote against them? I mean, can you see circumstances in which you would be happy to do that as P&R president?
Yeah, but I mean, I'd hope that those circumstances would be fewer as a result of the way in which we have committed, and indeed we are actually engaging with committees in the first place. But personally, I've never been shy of voicing an opinion when it doesn't accord with a committee's position, and I don't think I've shied away from it since I've been in this role either. So I think that's actually one of the strengths of the committee system and the consensus government that we've got, is that at the end of the day, we get better decisions if we do have a plurality of views and perspectives, and we can find a way through that accommodates those to the best of our ability.
Okay, we've kept you for basically 2 interviews now. You've been here about 3 hours. So thank you very much for your time, Deputy de Sausmarez.
Thank you very much for having me.